Good evening, and welcome back to the Sleepy Archive. Tonight, there is no need to do anything at all. You don't need to remember the dates. You don't need to follow every detail. This is history told slowly, the kind you're allowed to fall asleep to. So settle in. Let your shoulders sink into the bed. Let your breathing slow down. Tonight, we are climbing the cold stone stairs of a medieval castle in the deep of winter to ask a small and quiet question. How did kings and queens sleep when even their grandest rooms were bitterly, achingly cold? We will move slowly through the chamber and the firelight, the furs and the bells in the dark, in no hurry to arrive anywhere at all. Whenever you're ready, close your eyes. Let's begin. Imagine you are climbing a narrow stone stair deep inside an English royal castle on a night in the heart of January. The steps curve upward, worn smooth in the middle by years of quiet feet, and the walls press close on either side. Your hand trails along the stone, and the stone is cold, colder than the air, damp beneath your fingers like the inside of a well. Somewhere above, a door stands open, and a faint amber glow spills down to meet you. You step through into the great chamber, the room they called the Solar, the finest sleeping room in all the castle. It is a large space, and yet the cold has made it feel smaller, drawn in around the single point of firelight. The flagstones are strewn with rushes and dried herbs, and they whisper faintly underfoot, releasing a dry, green scent of old meadows. The air smells of wood smoke and beeswax, and beneath that, faintly, the mineral breath of stone that never truly warms. Along the walls hang tapestries and painted cloths, heavy and still, their colors dimmed to brown and rust in the low light. They stir, very slightly, though no one has touched them. That is the draft, moving behind them, sliding along the wall. And there, raised upon a low wooden platform against the far wall, stands the bed. It is the largest thing in the room, tall and dark and curtained on every side, a small chamber all its own. This is where a king would sleep, and even here, even in this grand and guarded place, the cold has come indoors to wait. Consider the walls, for the walls are the beginning of everything here. In a castle such as this, they were built thick, sometimes many feet of dressed stone packed with rubble at the core, raised to keep armies out and to hold the great weight of the towers above. Such walls were slow, patient things. They held whatever temperature had settled into them, and in the depth of winter what they held was cold. By January the stone had been chilling for months, since the first frosts of autumn, and it had drawn the cold down into its very heart. A fire on the hearth could warm the air of the room, could redden your face and hands if you stood near it, and still the wall a few feet behind you would remain like ice. Lay your palm flat against it, and the chill would climb into your wrist within moments. Worse than the cold was the damp. Stone breathes moisture, drawing it from the winter air, and on the coldest nights a faint sheen of water gathered on the inner walls, cool and slick to the touch. It smelled faintly of earth and rain, of the quarry the stones had come from long ago. In the corners, where the fire's warmth never reached, that damp lingered longest. So the chamber lived always in a strange division. There was the small, bright island of warmth by the hearth, and there was everything else, the far corners and the high ceiling and the great stone walls, holding their winter patiently through the night. You could cross the room in a few slow steps and feel the warmth fall away behind you like a cloak slipping from your shoulders. Look now to the windows, for they too let the cold come visiting. In a chamber of this age the windows were narrow, set deep in the thickness of the wall, splayed inward so that a little more light might reach the room. They were tall and slim, more like slots than the wide, bright windows of later houses, and they were few, because every opening in a castle wall was a weakness and a place for the winter to enter. Glass, clear glazed glass in the window, was a rare and costly thing, and even in a royal castle it was not to be found in every room. Where there was glass it came in small panes, thick and greenish and uneven, set in lead and letting through a soft, watery light. Where there was no glass there were only shutters, boards of oak hinged to the frame, closed against the night and barred from within. But what is never a perfect seal? The shutters warped a little with the seasons, and along their edges thin gaps opened, no wider than a finger, and through those gaps the winter air came sliding in a slow, cold thread. You could hold your hand near the shutter's edge and feel it, a fine cool ribbon of moving air, steady and quiet. On a windy night you would hear them too, the shutters, ticking and shifting faintly in their frames, and the wind outside would find every crack and draw a low, breathy note from it, like someone exhaling in another room. And so even sealed and barred, the window remained a place where the outside pressed gently, endlessly, against the inside. Now come at last to the bed itself, the heart of the chamber, the single most valuable object in the room. In a great household the bed was treasure. It was named in wills and passed down like land or plate or jewels, and a fine bed represented a fortune in timber, in craft, in cloth. Everything else in the chamber served it. The frame was heavy carved wood, oak most likely, dark with age and oil, its posts thick as a strong man's arm. Along the wood ran carving, patterns of leaves and vines and shields, worked slowly by hand over many weeks, so that even by firelight the surface seemed to move a little, alive with small shadows. Rising above the whole bed was the tester, a wooden canopy or a frame of cloth stretched flat overhead. A low ceiling of its own hung close above where the sleeper would lie. The tester was no mere ornament. It caught the worst of the cold that fell from the high stone ceiling and the drafts that drifted down from above, and it held a pocket of stiller, kinder air over the bed. To lie beneath it was to lie beneath a small roof within the great roof, sheltered twice over. Behind the head of the bed hung the cloth of estate, a rich panel of embroidered fabric fixed to the wall, marking this as the bed of someone of high rank. It caught the firelight in threads of dull gold, and it kept the sleeper's head from resting against the bare, weeping stone. The whole great structure stood there in the shadows, dark and patient, waiting for the night. The most important part of the great bed, on a bitter night, was the curtains. From the tester overhead hung heavy cloths on all four sides, long panels of wool or worsted, sometimes lined, reaching from the canopy down to the platform below. By day they were gathered back and tied to the posts, so that the bed sat open like a small stage. By night they were drawn. To draw the curtains was to close a room within a room. The rings ran along their rails with a soft, wooden rattle, and one by one the panels came across, until the sleeper lay entirely enclosed, walled in cloth on every side, sealed away from the cold vastness of the chamber. It was a small, dark, breathing space, no larger than the bed, and it was the warmest place in all the castle. Within that cloth chamber the air grew slowly kinder. The warmth of a sleeping body, held close and unable to drift away into the great cold room, gathered under the tester and made the little space endurable. The heavy curtains stopped the drafts that slid across the floor and fell from the high ceiling, and they muffled the sounds of the night, the ticking shutters and the settling stone, into something far away and soft. Inside, the light was almost gone, only the faintest orange line glowing where the curtains did not quite meet, marking the dying fire beyond. The wool smelled of dust and smoke and long use. And so the greatest lord in the land slept, in the end, in a small dark box of cloth, hiding from his own magnificent, freezing room. Notice, too, how the bed was lifted off the floor. It stood upon a low wooden platform, a dais, raising it a step above the flagstones. This was partly a matter of dignity, setting the great bed above the common level of the room, but it was also a matter of cold, for the floor was where the worst of the chill pooled and lay. Cold air is heavy, and it sinks. All through the winter night it slid down the walls and gathered along the flagstones in a slow, invisible tide, coldest of all at the level of the feet. To lift the bed, even a little above that floor, was to lift the sleeper out of the deepest cold, up into slightly better air. The rushes and dried herbs strewn across the stone helped a little too, a dry layer between foot and freezing floor, giving off their faint green scent when trodden. And then the walls themselves were dressed against the cold. The tapestries and arras that hung about the chamber were things of great beauty, worked with hunts and gardens and figures in faded thread, and they announced the wealth of the house. But they did more than please the eye. Hung a little away from the stone, they trapped a thin layer of still air between cloth and wall, and they broke the drafts, and they kept the naked, weeping stone from facing directly into the room. To stand near a tapestried wall was noticeably kinder than to stand near a bare one. The cloth was warm to the touch where the stone behind it was not, a soft skin drawn over the cold body of the castle. And yet, for all of it, the chamber remained cold. This is the strange truth of the great sleeping room, the quiet paradox at the center of it. Here was the finest room in the castle, hung with treasures, warmed by a fire, holding a bed worth a fortune, prepared by many careful hands, and still, on a January night, it was bitterly, achingly cold. Everything had been done that could be done. The walls were dressed with cloth, the windows shuttered and barred, the bed raised and curtained and canopied, the floor strewn against the chill. And the cold met each of these defenses and slipped past them anyway, slow and patient, through the shutter cracks and down the chimney's edge and up from the deep stone floor. There was one place cold beyond all the rest, and that was the little passage to the garderobe, the privy set into the thickness of the wall. Its shaft opened to the outside air far below, and up that shaft, all night long, came a steady breath of raw winter, a thin draught carrying the true cold of the world beyond the walls. Near that doorway the air was sharpest, and no tapestry could quite tame it. So the grandeur and the cold lived side by side, and neither drove the other out. The gold thread glowed, the carved oak gleamed, the rich curtains hung heavy and fine, and through all of it moved the cold, unhurried, at home. Wealth could buy beauty and comfort of a kind, but it could not buy warmth outright, not here, not in stone, not in the deep of winter. So the chamber settles. The fire is low. The walls are still. The great bed waits on its platform. Its curtains hang loose and dark. Overhead, the tester holds the shadows close. The tapestries do not move now. The shutters are barred. The cold keeps to its corners. Everything is quiet here. Everything is heavy and slow. The room breathes its long, cold breath and waits. Rest a while in it. There is nothing to do. There is only the stone and the cloth and the dark. We have wandered the cold room and the great curtained bed and found the cold at home in both. Now let us turn, slowly, toward the one thing in the chamber that pushed the cold back at all. The fire on the hearth, and the small nightly ritual that put it out. No need to sit up. Just keep listening. Let your attention drift now, gently, toward the far wall of the chamber where the great fireplace stands. It is deep January, and the hour has slid past supper into the long, unlit stretch of a midwinter night. The stone floor holds a cold that seeps upward through the thin soles of anyone standing near, and the air away from the flames carries a faint, mineral chill. Yet here, close to the hearth, the darkness softens into a low amber glow. A chamber groom moves quietly before the fire, a young man in a plain woolen tunic, his sleeves pushed back to the elbow. He has tended this fire since late afternoon, feeding it, watching it, coaxing it into steadiness. Beside him, stacked against the wall, sits the night's supply of fuel, split logs of oak and beech, and a low basket of charcoal, dark and light in the same breath. The fireplace itself is a broad arch set into the thickness of the wall, wide enough for a grown man to stand within, its stone lip darkened by years of smoke. Above it, a great tapering hood gathers the fumes and lifts them into a flue built deep inside the masonry, carrying the smoke up and away through the wall to the cold sky above. It is a clever thing, this wall fireplace, an improvement on the older way of doing things. For once, the smoke does not hang in the room. It rises, obediently, into the hood and is gone, and the air near the ceiling stays clear rather than stinging the eyes. The groom watches a curl of it bend toward the flue and vanish, and he is satisfied. The fire ticks and settles. A log shifts with a soft, dry sound, and a small shower of sparks rises briefly before dying. The smell here is warm and resinous, wood smoke, scorched bark, the faint sweetness of pine sap heated to the point of melting. It is the smell of every winter evening in this castle, familiar as breathing. You could stand here, near the light, and feel almost warm. A few feet back, the cold is already waiting. To understand the comfort of this fireplace, it helps to remember what came before it. In the oldest great halls, the fire was not set against the wall at all, but laid in the very center of the floor, on a low stone hearth open to the room on every side. The smoke from such a fire had nowhere to go but up, gathering under the high timber roof and drifting out slowly through a louved vent or simply through the gaps in the eaves. Those central hearths threw their heat evenly, it is true, warming the whole circle of people gathered round them. But they filled the hall with a haze that stung the eyes and blackened the beams, and they could not easily be built into a private upper chamber, where a smoking fire would have been unbearable in an enclosed space. So the great central fire belonged to the communal hall, and the sleeping rooms above went cold. The wall fireplace changed that. By setting the fire into the thickness of the wall and giving it a hood and a flue, the builders found a way to draw the smoke off cleanly and to put a fire in a room where people slept. It meant that a king or queen could have their own hearth in their own chamber, private and glowing, without choking on the fumes. The chamber groom knows nothing of this history, but he lives inside its result. He tends a fire that behaves itself, that sends its smoke up the flue and keeps the room breathable. The stone of the hood is warm to the touch where it faces the flames, and cold on its other side where it meets the night air. There was a cost to the cleverness, though, and it is felt in this very room. The old central fire warmed everyone around it. The wall fireplace warms only what stands directly before it. Its heat runs forward in a narrow fan and is swallowed by the vast cold space beyond. So the chamber is a room of two climates. Near the hearth, a pocket of gentle warmth. Beyond it, the ordinary winter dark. The fire gives what it can, and no more. Consider, for a moment, the sheer quantity of what a castle swallowed across a single winter. A fire like this one, kept burning through the long, cold months, consumed timber in amounts that are difficult to picture, cartload upon cartload, stacked and split and fed to the flames week after week without pause. A great household did not warm one room alone. There were fires in the hall, fires in the kitchens, fires in the chambers of the lord and lady and their most important guests, each of them hungry, each of them burning from before dawn until the fire was covered at night. Feeding them all through a hard winter meant reckoning in whole hillsides of felled trees. The wood did not arrive by itself. Behind every warm chamber stood a long chain of labor, men whose entire winter was given over to fuel. Woodcutters went out into the frozen forest and felled the standing timber, their axes ringing dully in the cold, their breath clouding white. The trunks were then hauled back, dragged by oxen or carted along frozen ruts to the castle yard. There the work went on. The logs were sawn to length and split with wedge and maul, the dry wood cracking cleanly, the green wood resisting. Then they were stacked, carefully, in woodpiles and undercrofts to season and to keep dry, ready to be carried up to the fires as they were needed. It was heavy, endless, unglamorous work, and it never truly stopped. The chamber groom is only the last link in that chain. He carries an armful of split oak up the stair, the rough bark scraping his forearms, and sets it down beside the hearth. He does not think of the woodcutter in the forest or the carter on the frozen road. He thinks only that the basket is full and that it will need filling again tomorrow. The fire takes another log and settles around it. Somewhere below, in the cold yard, the woodpile stands a little lower than it did yesterday. By spring, it will be gone. There is a second kind of fuel in the basket, quieter than the logs. Charcoal, wood already burned once in a slow, smothered fire until it became light, black, and porous, ready to give up its heat without smoke or flame. Beside the split oak, it looks almost weightless. Charcoal had a particular use in the bedchamber, and it is worth pausing over. Unlike raw wood, it burned without smoke and almost without visible flame, giving off only a steady, even heat and a low red glow. This made it suited to the brazier, a metal basket or pan on legs that could be filled with glowing charcoal and carried, still burning, from room to room. Imagine the brazier brought in on a cold evening, set down upon the stone floor a little way from the bed, its coals breathing a soft crimson light into the dark. It threw no leaping shadows and made no crackle. It simply sat there, glowing, warming the air immediately around it. For a chamber where someone was trying to rest, this quiet, smokeless heat was a gentler companion than an open fire. The chamber groom knows the trick of it. He rakes a few embers from the main fire, or lights the charcoal at its edge, and waits until the flames have died and only the steady glow remains before the brazier is fit to bring near a sleeping place. Raw, smoking coals were never carried in, only the clean, red heart of the fire. The glow of good charcoal is a strange and lovely thing to watch. It pulses very faintly, brightening and dimming as the air moves over it, a slow red breathing in the dark. It gives no roar and no snap, only warmth and that deep, dull light. There is a hush to a charcoal brazier that an open fire never has. It asks for no tending, no feeding, no watching for sparks. It simply glows and warms and slowly fades. A patient, silent little fire. Now the evening deepens, and somewhere across the castle a bell begins to ring. Slow, single strokes, carried thin through the cold air. It is the curfew bell, and its meaning is very old and very practical. When it sounded, the household fires were to be damped down and covered for the night. The word itself carries its purpose within it. Curfew comes from the Old French couvre-feu, quite simply, cover the fire. It was not a poetic phrase but an instruction, a nightly command that spread across medieval Europe. When the bell rings, bank your fire, cover it, and let no flame burn unwatched into the dark. The reason was fear, and it was a reasonable fear. A castle was full of things that burned. Timber floors and roof beams, woolen hangings, straw and rushes strewn underfoot, stored wood and oil and grease. All of it dry, all of it close together, and all of it lit through the evening by open flames. A single fire left burning while the household slept could, in an hour, become a disaster that no one woke in time to stop. So the curfew bell was a discipline against catastrophe. It gathered the whole community into a single nightly habit that when darkness truly came, the fires would be made safe before anyone lay down to sleep. It was a small ritual repeated every night of every year, unremarkable precisely because it was never skipped. The chamber groom lifts his head at the sound of the bell. He has heard it every winter night of his life, and his hands already know what must follow. There is no hurry in him, only the slow certainty of a task that comes at the same hour, always. The bell rings on, unhurried, a few notes, and then silence. The fire before him burns as brightly as ever, for now. But its time is nearly done. The groom kneels before the hearth to do the night's last work. This is the covering of the fire, the small, careful ritual that the curfew bell has called for, and he performs it slowly, without waste. First he takes the iron and rakes the burning logs apart, breaking the fire down from a blaze into a bed of glowing embers. The flames sink and shrink as he works, the bright tongues collapsing into a low red heap. Then he draws the ashes up and over the embers, heaping the soft gray powder across the coals until the glow is buried and only a faint warmth shows through. Banked in this way, the fire will not flame, but neither will it wholly die. Deep under the ash, a few coals may smolder until morning. In some households there was a special object for this very task, a curfew, a broad metal cover, often of copper or iron, shaped like a great half-dome that could be set down over the raked embers against the wall. It smothered the fire, cutting off the air, keeping any stray spark from reaching the rushes on the floor while the household slept. Whether by ash or by metal cover, the purpose was the same: no open flame left burning in the night. The groom sits back on his heels when it is done. Where a fire burned a moment ago, there is now a low gray mound, faintly warm, its light almost gone. The smell of smoke lingers, but the crackle has fallen silent. The room is suddenly much darker. He gathers the iron and the basket and rises. His work for the day is finished, the fire is safe, the chamber made ready for the night. Behind him the buried embers give off their last thin warmth, and the shadows, no longer held back by firelight, close gently inward. The chamber is quiet now, and dim, and slowly cooling. The bright heart of the room has been put to bed. With the fire covered, the long cold hours begin, and the chamber's warmth starts its slow retreat. This was the quiet price of the curfew, that the very thing which kept the castle safe from fire also left the sleeping room to grow cold through the deepest part of the night. Stone does not hold heat kindly. All evening the great walls and the flagged floor had stood in the fire's glow, drinking its warmth into their cold mass, and giving almost nothing back. Now, with the flames smothered, the stone began instead to pull the last warmth from the air, so that the chamber cooled not slowly but steadily, hour by hour, toward the temperature of the winter outside. The room gave back cold, patiently, all night long. There was no way around it. To keep a fire burning unwatched was to risk everything. To cover it was to accept the cold. And so, between the hush of the curfew bell and the first gray light of morning, the warmest room in the castle became merely a dark stone box, holding a little fading heat near a heap of buried ash. Picture the chamber in the small hours, long after the groom has gone. The banked embers glow so faintly beneath their ashes that they scarcely light the hearthstone. The air, which was gentle near the fire at dusk, has gone sharp and still. Breath would show, faintly, in what little light remained. This was the ordinary condition of a medieval winter night, even for the greatest in the land. The fire warmed the evening. It could not warm the sleep. The hours of deepest cold were the hours when no fire burned at all. And yet the household slept through it, as they always had, wrapped and waiting for the dawn. In the dark, the stone breathed out its cold. The embers held their last warmth, and gave it up, coal by coal, to the night. The room is very still now. The fire is covered. The bell has long since fallen silent. Under the gray ash, a few coals remain. They glow, very faintly. a dull red, almost gone. There is no flame. There is no crackle. Only the smell of old smoke and the cold coming slowly in. The stone holds its chill. The ash holds its little warmth. Neither one hurries. Somewhere a last ember settles, with a sound almost too soft to hear. Then nothing. The dark is complete and gentle and deep. Rest here a while, in the fading warmth, and let the cold keep its distance a little longer. So the fire is covered, and the warmth begins to bleed away into the stone. But there was another warmth in that chamber, closer and more patient than any fire. The warmth built into the bed itself, layer by careful layer, against the long, cold night. Let's drift a little nearer to it. There is nothing you need to do. By now the fire in the great chamber had settled into a low and steady glow, and the room had grown quiet enough to hear the small work of hands. Two chamber servants moved to the bed at the far wall, that vast wooden frame standing waist-high on its dark carved posts. It was the largest piece of furniture the king or queen would ever own, and it was tended each night with the same slow care. You would not simply climb into such a bed. It was built first, layer upon layer, the way one might build a small warm nest against the winter. The servants worked without hurry, folding back the topmost coverings, smoothing what lay beneath, testing the linen with a flat and patient palm. Under everything lay the frame itself, a lattice of stout ropes drawn tight from side to side, or on older beds a set of plain wooden boards. You could hear the ropes creak faintly as a knee pressed the edge, a soft complaint of hemp and timber. That creak was the true floor of the bed, the thing all the softness rested upon. The chamber smelled of cold stone and beeswax, and, nearer the bed, of clean dry linen and the faint grassy sweetness of the mattress underneath. A little tallow smoke drifted from the candle a servant carried, its flame leaning as she passed. She set it in a niche and left it burning low, so the work could be seen but the room stayed dim. There was no ceremony yet in this, only preparation. The great bed was being made ready to hold a single sleeping body through the longest dark of the year, and everything about its making was aimed at one plain end: to keep the killing cold an arm's length away until morning. So the servants folded and smoothed, and the ropes creaked, and the candle burned. The bed waited, half open, its curtains gathered at the posts like sails not yet let down. And you, drifting near it, could feel how much warmth a person must gather about themselves to sleep in such a place at all. The making of the bed began at the very bottom, close against the ropes, with a coarse mattress of straw or of flock. Flock was the humbler stuff, a packing of wool scraps and cloth ends beaten loose, and straw was older still, dry stalks stuffed thick into a sturdy sack of ticking. It gave off a low rustling sound whenever it was pressed, a sound like a hand moving through dry autumn leaves. This bottom layer was not meant to be soft. It was meant to lift the sleeper clear of the ropes and to hold a cushion of still air, and even a king lay upon such humble filling without a second thought. Above the ropes, below the finery, the straw did its quiet work. Upon the coarse mattress the servants laid the great feather bed, and here the difference was plain to the eye and to the hand. It was a deep sack packed full of down and small feathers, so thick that it sagged and swallowed the arm to the elbow when pressed. You could see one servant plump it along its length, working the feathers, even so no cold hollow was left in the middle. The feather bed was the true warmth of the whole arrangement, for down traps the body's own heat and gives it slowly back through the night. To sink into it was to be held from below in something soft and yielding, the straw a firm floor far beneath. 2 mattresses, one hard and one deep, and only then the linen. Over the feathers came the sheets, smooth lengths of woven linen drawn tight and tucked at the sides. Fine linen for royalty, close and cool and faintly sweet with the smell of the press and the herbs it was stored among. At the first touch it was cold, almost startling against a warm palm. But linen holds no chill of its own for long. It took the warmth of whatever lay against it and slowly gave that warmth back, so the cold of first touch faded within a few slow breaths. The servants smoothed the last wrinkle from it and stepped back, and the lower half of the bed was made. Above the linen the servants began to lay the coverings, and here the weight of the bed grew with each layer. First came the wool blankets, thick and heavy and a little rough, woven close so that no draught could pass through. You could smell the faint lanolin warmth of the wool, that dense animal smell that clung to it even after washing. Wool holds warmth even when it is damp, and in a stone chamber where the very walls wept cold, that was no small thing. The blankets were folded double at the foot and drawn up smooth, their weight settling over the linen like a hand laid flat. Beneath them the bed had already begun, very faintly, to warm. Over the wool came the coverlet, and this was the grand covering, the one a visitor would see and remember. For a king or a queen it was a thing of quiet splendor, its outer face rich cloth, its underside lined with fur against the skin of the night. The fur was the true purpose of it, soft and dense and deeply warm. The finest were lined with ermine, that small white winter fur speckled with dark tips, or with miniver, the pale gray and white belly fur prized above almost all others. To draw such a coverlet up to the chin was to feel the fur settle warm along the throat and shoulders, a softness that took the last of the chill away. Few in the whole kingdom slept beneath anything half so warm. The servants smoothed the coverlet and turned its corner back in a neat fold, ready for the sleeper's hand. The fur caught the low candlelight and seemed almost to breathe, its long hairs stirring in the faint moving air of the room. Wool below, fur above, and the deep feathers beneath them all. The bed was becoming what it was meant to be, a small warm world stacked layer on careful layer. and still there were the pillows and the bolster and the coverings for the head to come. At the head of the bed the servants set the bolster, a long firm cushion running the whole width of the frame like a low wall. It was stuffed dense, and it was not truly for the head to lie on, but for the pillows to rest against, and for the sleeper to be propped high upon. Behind it the linen was tucked smooth and tight. Against the bolster they banked the pillows, soft and plump and cased in fine linen, some filled with down and some with feathers of the same close warmth as the great bed below. There might be several, stacked and leaned, for a king or queen did not lie flat as we might. You could press a pillow and watch it slowly rise again, the feathers whispering as they settled. The linen of the pillows was cool and smooth against the cheek, faintly scented with the herbs of the linen chest, lavender perhaps, or dried rose, laid among the folds to keep the moth away. That small sweetness was the last thing a face would meet before sleep. A cool, clean cloth, and beneath it the deep, soft give of down. For the body itself, there was clothing made for the night, for none slept bare in such cold. There was the bedgown, a loose warm robe of wool or lined stuff drawn on over the shift, and there was the nightcap of soft linen tied beneath the chin. The cap mattered more than we might think, for a great deal of the body's warmth slips away through an uncovered head. The nightcap was plain and close-fitting, warming the scalp and the ears, and even a crowned head wore one without vanity through the long midwinter nights. Over it the bolster and the pillows rose, so the sleeper lay swaddled and capped and robed against the dark. So dressed for sleep and banked against the bolster, a body could keep its own warmth close about it. The servants set the last pillow straight and turned to the coverings, for the bed was nearly ready to be closed. Around the great bed hung the curtains, heavy lengths of wool or thick woven cloth suspended from the frame or from a rail above, and now the servants began to draw them shut. They moved from post to post, unhooking each gathered fold and letting it fall, and the cloth came down with a soft, dragging hush along its rings. One side, then another, until the bed was closed on every side. These curtains were not for privacy alone, though privacy they gave. Their true work was warmth, for once drawn they turned the open bed into a small enclosed room, a warm tent of cloth standing within the cold stone chamber. The great room outside might stay bitter all night, and it would matter far less within. Inside that closed space the sleeper's own breath and body heat had nowhere to escape. Slowly, through the hours, the air between the curtains grew warm and close, held in by the wool on every side. It was the same plain principle as cupped hands about a candle flame, only built at the scale of a bed. A little warmth, kept in, becomes enough. You can imagine the sound of it from within, how the noises of the chamber grew muffled and far once the curtains fell. The crackle of the low fire, the settling of the old timbers, all of it softened to a dim and distant murmur through the heavy cloth. The candlelight beyond became a faint glow through the weave, gold, and blurred. The air inside smelled of wool and fur and warm linen, of the herbs in the pillows and the faint smoke that clung to everything in a chamber heated by fire. It was a still, enclosed, animal-warm smell, the smell of a den made ready. Within it a body could gather its heat and hold it. So the curtains hung closed on their rings, and the great bed became its own small world apart. Whatever the winter did to the stone and the glass and the flagstones beyond, here inside the cloth the cold was kept at the door. And still, before the sleeper lay down, there was the matter of the sheets themselves. Before a body would lie down between them, the sheets had to be robbed of their chill, for cold linen against warm skin could steal sleep for an hour. For this there was the warming pan, and a servant now carried it in from the hearth. It was a broad, shallow pan of brass or copper on a long wooden handle, its lid pierced and closed over a bed of hot embers within. The embers had been lifted glowing from the fire and shut inside the pan, and through the pierced lid you could see them faintly breathing red. The servant held it out level, and the smell of warm metal and hot ash drifted with it across the chamber. It was heavy, and it was handled with care, for the metal grew hot enough to scorch. Reaching in through the parted curtains, the servant slid the pan flat between the sheets and drew it slowly down the length of the bed. It had to be kept always moving, gliding along under the linen, or it would leave a brown scorch on the cloth. Back and forth it passed, and where it went the sheets grew warm. A faint smell of warmed linen rose from the bed. You could almost hear it, the low whisper of the pan sliding over the sheet, the soft click of embers shifting inside as it turned at the foot and came back up. The linen that had been cold as the room itself now held a gentle heat, warmed through in a way no body shivering could have managed alone. The killing chill of first touch was taken clean away. When the sheets were warmed, the servant drew the pan out and set it aside, and the bed was at last ready to receive its sleeper. The whole labor of the night came down to this small mercy, that one might lie down into warmth instead of into cold. It was a humble tool for so grand a bed, a pan of embers on a stick. Yet a king or a queen valued it as much as any jewel on a winter night, for it bought the one thing the cold could not be argued out of: a warm place to lay the body down. The warming pan took the chill from the sheets, but the feet needed a warmth that lasted, for cold feet can keep a body awake long after the rest of it is easy. So there were heated stones, or bricks, made ready at the edge of the fire until they held a deep and steady heat. Wrapped each in a cloth so it would not burn, they were tucked down at the foot of the bed. A stone gives back its warmth slowly, far into the night, long after embers would have died. Down beneath the coverings the sleeper's feet found that steady warmth waiting and rested against it, and the last cold corner of the bed was answered. It was a small comfort, and it was one of the most reliable the winter allowed. There was another old habit in these beds, one that seems strange to us now. Many did not lie flat, but slept half upright, propped high on the banked bolster and pillows, the upper body raised well above the covers. They had reasons of health and breathing for it, and reasons of simple warmth as well. Raised against the pillows, the sleeper's head stayed above the coldest air that pooled low, and the heavy coverings could be drawn snug about the chest. It was a posture of half-sitting rest, familiar and ordinary to them, though it would feel odd to a body used to lying flat. In the dim warmth behind the curtains, propped and capped and covered, they settled. And there was the plainest warmth of all, the warmth of another body close by. Beds were shared as a matter of course, and two who slept side by side gave each other heat through the whole long night without a thought. It was ordinary, unremarked, an animal comfort as old as cold itself. So the feet found the wrapped stone, and the back found the bolster, and where another lay near, the two shared what warmth they had. Layer by layer and habit by habit, the cold was held at bay by nothing more than care and cloth, and the heat a living body makes. And the great bed, warmed and closed, was ready for sleep at last. The pan was gone. The stones lay warm. The curtains hung closed. Inside, the air was still. It smelled of wool and warm linen. It smelled of herbs and faint smoke. The sheets had lost their chill. The feathers held the body soft. The fur lay warm along the throat. Outside, the winter stayed at the stone. It could not reach in here. The cloth held it away. A candle glowed beyond the curtains. Its light was gold and blurred. The room had gone quiet. The bed was a small warm world. Nothing in it stirred. Nothing needed doing now. Only the slow warmth remained, gathered and kept in enough. The bed is warm now, and closed, and waiting. But a royal bed was never made by the sleeper, and never lain in alone. Around it moved a whole quiet household, with its own slow ceremony for putting a king to bed. Let us watch them a while, softly from the shadows. When a king made ready for sleep, it was never a quiet slipping away, never the simple business of lying down alone. It was a small ceremony, worn smooth by repetition, carried out the same way night after night through the long midwinter dark. The chamber had already gone still, and the fire had sunk to a low red seam, and the great bed stood waiting behind its heavy curtains. Yet the king did not simply cross the room and climb in. Around him moved the men whose whole duty was this hour. The grooms of the chamber, the yeomen who tended the room and the bed, the trusted body servant who would stay closest of all. They knew their places without being told, and they moved without hurry, and their soft footsteps made almost no sound on the rushes. You would have noticed how many people it took to put one man to bed. A monarch was rarely alone, and going to sleep was a semi-public thing, attended and observed, folded into the ordinary shape of the household. Privacy, in the way we might think of it, was not part of a king's night. The air held the smell of tallow and cold stone, and under it the faint animal warmth of wool and fur. Somewhere a candle guttered and steadied. A groom stood by with a taper, waiting, his face half-lit and patient. Another held a folded cloth over his arm. There was no ceremony of grandeur here, nothing to marvel at, only the calm sequence of small tasks done in their proper order. The undressing, the searching of the bed, the last cup, the prayers, the drawing of the curtains. Each step had its moment, and none was rushed. It is worth remembering that a king could command armies and could not, by custom, undress himself. Other hands did that work, and he stood and let them, as he had stood every night of his life. It was simply the way the night began. And so the room settled into its ritual, unhurried and familiar, while outside the walls the frost deepened and the passages grew colder still. The bed was made ready first. Before the king could lie down, the great bed had to be made and searched by hand, and this was done with slow, deliberate care. The yeomen of the chamber drew back the coverings and ran their palms across the mattress and the linens, feeling along the seams and into the folds. They were looking for anything that should not be there. A pin, a fold gone hard, a hidden thing, some small harm left in the bedding. It was an old habit, half practical and half ceremonial, and it was performed every night without question. One servant would press his hands the length of the bed while another watched, and the linen would be smoothed and drawn tight again, and the pillows turned and set in their places. You can picture the quiet of it. The soft rasp of hands over cloth, the creak of the bed frame as weight leaned upon it, the faint rustle of the drawn-back curtains. No one spoke much. The work was known too well to need words. The searching came from a world where a king had enemies he could not see, and where the bed, of all places, was where a man lay most helpless. So the household made certain the bed was clean and safe, and only then was it ready to receive him. It was a kind of care that looked like habit and was, underneath, a form of guarding. The bedchamber smelled of clean linen and the cold sweetness of herbs strewn among the sheets, lavender or woodruff crushed faintly by the servant's hands. The candlelight fell across the pale cloth and made long, soft shadows that shifted as a groom moved past. When the searching was done, the bed lay open and waiting, the covers turned down in a neat fold, the pillows plumped and squared. Everything was in order. Everything was as it had been the night before and would be the night after. Only then did the attention turn back to the king himself, still standing in the middle of the room, still dressed, waiting for the next slow step of the ritual to begin. The undressing came next. The undressing of a king was a task shared among several hands, done in a fixed, and unhurried order. One servant lifted away the outer robe, heavy with fur trim and cold from the day's chill, and folded it over his arm. Another loosened the girdle and drew off the long gown, and took the rings from the king's fingers one by one and set them aside. Each garment passed from the king to a groom, and from the groom to its proper place, and none of it was hurried. The men worked close to him, quiet and practiced, their hands moving through motions they had made 1,000 times. The king simply stood and let it happen, lifting an arm when needed, saying little. You would have felt the coldness of the room settle on him as each layer came away. The warmth of the great gown gone, then the lighter robe, until he stood in his plain nightshirt of soft linen, and a servant brought a furred nightgown or a warm cloth about his shoulders against the chill. 2 grooms held candles as the work went on, and their small flames leaned and swayed with the movement of the room. The light caught the folds of the linen and the gleam of the rings being gathered up. The air smelled of tallow smoke and cold wool and the faint warmth of a body that had worn those clothes all day. It is a strange thing to think that a man of such power was handled so gently and so completely by other people, dressed and undressed like a child, and thought nothing of it. It was the way of his rank. Servants existed for exactly this, and the king had never known anything else. When the last garment was folded and carried away, a groom brought forward a warmed cup, a little spiced wine or a posset to settle him before sleep, and the king drank it slowly while standing by the bed. The cup was taken again, empty. The room grew quieter still, and the servants drew back a pace, waiting, for the next part of the night belonged not to them, but to the prayers. The king turned toward the bedside. Before he lay down, the king said his night prayers, and these were spoken at the very edge of the bed, in the low light, with the household drawn back into the shadows. He might kneel a moment on a cushion set ready for him, or simply bow his head where he stood, his hands folded, his voice barely above a murmur. The words were the ones he said every night, worn familiar as the stones of the chapel, and he did not have to think to find them. A prayer against the dangers of the dark, a commending of himself to God's keeping until morning, the same phrases his father had said, and his father before him. You would have heard almost nothing. A soft muttering, the small sounds of a man breathing between the lines, the faint hiss of a candle. The grooms stood still and silent, their own heads lowered, and for that little while the busy ritual paused, and the room held a kind of hush. Night was a fearful time in the medieval mind, full of unseen things, and sleep itself was thought of as a small rehearsal for death, a nightly letting go into the dark. So the prayer at the bedside was no idle habit. It was a man setting his soul in order before he surrendered his waking mind to whatever the night held. The candle by the bed threw a warm and trembling light across his hands and the pale linen, and the cold beyond its reach pressed in from the corners of the chamber. The air smelled of wax and of the herb-strewn sheets, and somewhere far off a door settled with a low wooden groan. When the last words were said, the king crossed himself, slow and unhurried, and rose, or lifted his head, and turned at last toward the bed that had been made and searched and turned down for him. The servants stirred again in the shadows, ready for the final steps. A groom moved to the bedside curtains and took the heavy cloth in his hands. The night was nearly closed now, folded down to this last small circle of light. The curtains were ready to be drawn. At last the king climbed into the great bed and settled back into the piled pillows, and a groom drew the heavy curtains closed around him. They were thick things, wool or embroidered stuff, hung from the high frame to keep out the cold and the drafts and the little light that remained. When they were pulled to, the king lay in a small dark room of his own within the larger room. The rings of the curtains slid along their rail with a soft, dragging sound, and then the cloth fell still, and the candlelight beyond it dimmed to a faint glow seeping through the seams. Inside, the king lay wrapped and warm, closed away from the chamber, closed away from the night. You can imagine the quiet of that enclosed space. The muffled hush behind the drawn cloth, the smell of warm linen and one's own breath, the faint amber line where the curtains did not quite meet. It was as near to private as a king ever came, and even then, others remained just beyond the cloth. For outside the curtains the room was not empty, and would not be empty until morning. The drawing of the curtains did not send everyone away. It only closed the king into his warmth while the household arranged itself for the long watch of the night around him. The great bed stood like a small shuttered house in the middle of the cold chamber, and within it the most powerful man in the land lay still and warm and unseen. The curtains breathed a little in the draught and settled again. It is worth pausing on how completely the bed enclosed him, curtained on every side, a private dark inside a guarded room. He could hear the muffled sounds of the chamber, the shift of a servant's foot, the small crack of the dying fire, but he could see none of it now. And so the king was abed, drawn in behind his curtains, warm in the heart of the cold castle. But he was not, and would never be, alone in the room. Below the bed, another was making ready to lie down. Once the king was settled behind his curtains, a trusted servant made his own bed close by, low upon the floor, so that the monarch was never left alone through the night. Sometimes it was a truckle bed, a small, plain wooden frame on little wheels, rolled out from beneath the great bed where it had lain hidden all day. Sometimes it was only a straw pallet, a rough mattress laid down across the chamber door. The truckle bed slid out with a low rumble of its wheels over the boards, and the servant unrolled his blanket upon it, and lay down almost beneath his sleeping master, close enough to hear him turn. Or, if he lay at the door, he stretched himself across the threshold, so that no one could pass in or out without stepping over him and waking him. You can see the plainness of it. A thin pallet on cold stone, a single coarse blanket, a man lying in his clothes for the little warmth they gave. No curtains for him, no pillows piled high, no furs, just the floor and the draft that crept along it, and the long hours until dawn. This was the whole purpose of his place. The monarch was never to be left unguarded and never truly alone, and so a body was always near, within arm's reach, between the king and the door. It was an old and settled custom, and the servant who slept there was among the most trusted in the household. The floor smelled of rushes and cold stone, and the faint tallow smoke drifting from the watching candle. From below the bed, or from across the doorway, the servant could hear the small night sounds of the king, the slow breathing, the shift of weight, the creak of the frame. He was there to be near, not to be comfortable. If the king woke and called, a voice would answer at once out of the dark. If a door opened where it should not, a body lay ready to feel it. So the two of them lay close in the cold chamber, the king above and the servant below, a few feet apart and a whole world apart. One wrapped in furs, one on the bare floor. Through the whole of the night a single candle was left burning, the watching candle, set in a safe holder where its light could not reach the bed hangings. It was never allowed to go out. Its small flame stood almost still in the closed air, and its glow lay soft across the floor and the low pallet and the foot of the great curtained bed. Beyond the chamber, in the cold passage outside the door, a night watch kept its slow round. You might have heard the muffled tread of a guard passing, the faint clink of something at his belt, the creak of a distant door, and then the quiet closing in again. The castle did not fully sleep, even now. The servant on the floor lay in that thin candlelight, and did not truly rest as his master rested. He drifted and half woke, listening, feeling the cold rise up through the pallet from the stone. A few feet above him the king lay wrapped in furs and heavy coverings, warm behind his curtains, while the man who guarded him lay in the draft with a single blanket. It is a plain and honest thing to notice, and worth sitting with a moment. Nearness without comfort. The servant was as close to the king as anyone in the realm could be, and yet the warmth was all above him, and the cold was all his own. Their bodies lay near together, and their nights were nothing alike. The candle burned down slowly, hour by hour, and the light it gave never changed much, a small steady amber against the deep black of the winter chamber. The smell of wax hung faint in the air, mingled with cold stone and the herbs in the sheets, and the last thin breath of the dead fire. So the long night passed in that watched and guarded quiet, the king asleep in his furs, the servant half asleep on the floor, the flame keeping its patient vigil between them, and the watch pacing softly in the passage beyond. Nothing happened, and nothing was meant to. That was the whole point of it, this stillness held in place by candle and by watch. The night simply held and waited for the light. Now the chamber was quiet. The candle burned low and steady. The king lay still behind his curtains. Below him the servant lay on the floor. His breathing slowed and evened out. The cold pressed in, and he stayed. Nothing moved in the room. The watch walked softly in the passage. A door settled, far away, and was still. The fire was long dead now. Only the one small flame kept its place. Its light lay warm on the floor. There was nothing left to do. Every step of the ritual was done. The bed made, the prayers said, the curtains drawn. You can let it all soften now. The king in his furs. The servant on his pallet. The flame keeping watch. The frost thickened on the stones outside. Inside, the warmth held under the coverings. The night held everyone in its quiet. Sleep came slowly and stayed. The candle burned on alone. And the cold castle rested until morning. We leave the king behind his curtains, guarded and warm, and the servant on the cold floor below. Along the passage, another door, another cold and richly hung room. The queen's chamber, and beyond it, the frozen roads that the whole wandering court traveled all winter long. No need to move. Just follow the sound of the voice. Move now, softly, from the king's cold rooms to another door along the passage, where the queen lay through the same long winter night. Her chamber sat deeper within the castle, folded away from the outer wall, and it was warmer than any other room you had passed. The moment you stepped inside, the air changed. It thickened. It held the low warmth of banked embers and the faint sweetness of dried herbs strewn across the rushes. The walls here were dressed more thickly than the king's, hung not with one layer of cloth, but with two, sometimes three. Heavy woven hangings covered the stone from the beams to the floor, and behind them, in places, a second cloth again, so that the cold masonry seemed to disappear entirely behind wool. Where a bare hall would have breathed damp stone at you, this room breathed only fabric and warmth and smoke gone soft. Her bed stood large and curtained at the room's warm heart, the drapes drawn close on every side, a small dim country of its own. The linens were finer, the coverlets deeper, weighed down with furs against the season. And yet, if you laid your palm flat against the wall behind the nearest hanging, you would still feel it there. The old cold. Pressing in through the stone, patient, unbothered by all the cloth in the world. Near her bed, on low pallets and truckles, her ladies slept. 2, 3, sometimes more, women who dressed her and combed her hair and never quite left her alone. Their breathing filled the small dark room, a soft, uneven tide beneath the curtains, so that even in the deepest hour she was not truly by herself. A queen was rarely by herself. You could hear the fire settle. You could hear one of the women turn on her pallet, the rustle of a coverlet, then stillness again. Outside, far off, the wind moved against the shutters, and inside, all of it was held away behind wool and fur and the warm bodies of sleeping women. It was, for a castle in midwinter, as close to comfort as the age could build. Consider how that warmth was made, for it was made by hand, layer upon patient layer. The queen's household understood the cold as an enemy that could be softened but never wholly beaten, and so they crowded her room with everything that held heat and turned it back. The hangings on the walls were the first defense, and they were thick, and there were many. Between the outer stone and the woven cloth ran a thin band of trapped air, and that stillness was itself a kind of warmth. Drafts that would have slid freely across a bare hall met wool instead and were quieted. You could stand in the center of the room and feel almost no moving air at all, only the settled heat rising from the low fire and the bodies within. It was a stillness you could sink into. The floor was strewn with rushes, and among them dried herbs and sweet flowers laid down in autumn, so that a foot pressing down released a faint green smell, old and grassy and calm. Over the bed hung a tester, a canopy of cloth, and around it the curtains fell to the floor, sealing the sleeper into a pocket of her own breath and warmth. Within those curtains, on a bitter night, the air grew mild. Here and there a brazier of glowing coals stood on the stone, tended low, giving off that dull red light that asks the eyes to close. The smell of it was warm and faintly bitter, charcoal and ash, threading through the sweetness of the herbs. A little dish of embers, and around it, a room learning to be gentle. And still, for all of it, the cold had its small victories. The window, though shuttered and hung, breathed a thin thread of night air along its edge. The far corner, past the reach of the fire, stayed chill enough that no one lingered there. A hand left outside the coverlet would slowly grow cool. So the warmth of the queen's chamber was never a still fact but a nightly labor, built at dusk and failing by dawn, held together by wool and coal and the closeness of sleeping women. A soft country, defended inch by inch against the dark. Now let the walls of that warm chamber fall away, and think of the strange truth beneath all of it, that the queen and the king and the whole vast household around them rarely stayed anywhere for very long. A royal court in these centuries was not a still thing rooted in one great castle. It moved. It moved almost constantly, from residence to residence, across the seasons and across the realm. There were sound reasons for the wandering, and they were plain ones. A great household ate an enormous amount, and the food had to come from somewhere. Each royal estate could feed the court only so long before its stores of grain and salted meat and ale ran low. Rather than haul all that provision across bad roads to one fixed place, it was simpler to bring the court to the food, to arrive, to eat down the stores of an estate, and then to move on to the next before the first was bare. There was more to it than the belly, though the belly mattered. A king was expected to be seen. To rule was in part to appear, to ride into a town, to sit in judgment, to let the people of a distant county look upon their sovereign with their own eyes. Justice traveled with the court. Disputes were heard, grievances settled, loyalties renewed simply by the fact of arrival. And so the great ones passed through the land like a slow tide, resting a week here, a fortnight there, seldom a whole season anywhere. The roads knew them. The villages along the way knew the dust or the mud of their coming, the long line of carts, the outriders, the banners hanging heavy in the cold. For the queen, this meant that the warm and richly hung chamber you had just stood in was never truly permanent. It was hers for a while. Then it was left behind, and another cold room in another castle became hers instead, and the whole labor of warmth began again. Rest, in such a life, was a thing carried from place to place, never simply owned. There was one more reason the court kept moving, and it was a quiet, practical one, having to do with what a great household did to the very rooms it lived in. A castle full of people, fires, animals, and cooking was, after some weeks, no longer a pleasant place. It grew fouled. It needed to be left so that it might breathe. Think of what gathered in the stone over a long stay. Smoke from every hearth and torch settled on the walls and beams, blackening them by slow degrees. The rushes on the floor, walked over and spilled upon, went stale beneath the feet. The privies filled. The kitchens greased the air. Slowly, invisibly, a castle that had been fresh grew heavy and close and sour, and no amount of daily sweeping could quite keep pace with so many living bodies. So when the court rode away, it left the building to the servants and the season. The foul rushes were carried out and burned. The floors were scrubbed down to bare stone. The windows and doors were thrown open to the cold, clean winter air, and the whole castle was let stand empty and airing, day after day, until the smoke smell faded and the damp blew through and out again. By the time the household returned, weeks or months later, the place had recovered itself. The walls, though still soot-marked, no longer breathed staleness. The air moved clean through the halls. A castle, in this way, was less a home than a garment, worn for a while, then hung out to air before it was worn again. You can almost feel the difference at the doorway, arriving at a place freshly rested. The cold is sharp, but it is clean. The stone smells of nothing but stone and winter. There is no weight of old smoke, only the plain chill of a house that has stood empty and open to the sky. And then, of course, the household would move in and light its fires and lay its rushes and begin once more the slow work of fouling the very rooms it had come to warm. Round and round the seasons turned, and the court turned with them. Consider, then, what it meant to move so often, for a household did not travel light. When the queen left one castle for the next, She did not simply arrive and find a home waiting. She brought the home with her, packed piece by piece into carts, and rebuilt it at the far end of the road. The very bed was taken apart and carried along. The great frame, the boards, the ropes, the heavy mattress, all of it loaded and hauled. The curtains that sealed the bed against drafts, the tester overhead, the wall hangings that had made the chamber warm, the deep coverlets and the furs, folded and bundled onto the wagons. The plate for the table, the linens, the cushions, the very dishes she ate from, all of it traveled. So the long line of carts that crawled along the winter road held, in a sense, an entire dismantled household. Cloth and timber and metal, jolting through the cold, wrapped against the wet, guarded by tired men on tired horses. It moved slowly, as such trains must, the wheels sinking in the churned mud, the oxen breathing white into the gray air. And at the journey's end waited a castle that was, for the moment, only bare stone. Cold rooms. Empty walls. A great hall echoing and dim, unheated, holding nothing but the chill of its own emptiness. Into this the household poured itself and set to work. The transformation was quick, quicker than you might think. Servants hung the walls with the cloth from the carts, and the bare stone vanished behind wool. They raised the bed and drew its curtains, laid the rushes, spread the linens, kindled the fires. In the space of a single afternoon, a cold and empty shell could be dressed into a warm and living chamber, the queen's own room reassembled around her wherever she happened to be. There is something almost tender in it, this carrying of comfort from place to place, this refusal to let the cold have the last word. The bed she slept in was the same bed, though the castle was always changing. Home was not a place. Home was the cloth and the timber, and it followed her down every frozen road. Stay a while with that arrival, for it is worth the dwelling. Picture the household reaching a dark castle at the close of a short winter day, the light already failing, the rooms ahead of them cold as the open air. Nothing was ready. Everything had to be made. The great doors were opened onto blackness and chill. Inside, the halls held the deep, unmoving cold of stone that no fire had touched for weeks, a cold that came up through the soles of the feet and settled in the hands. The air smelled of nothing but damp and time. There was no warmth anywhere to be found, only the promise of warmth, waiting in the carts outside. And so, against the falling dark, the work began. Servants moved through the rooms with rushlights and candles, small flames trembling in the draught, carving little pools of gold out of the gloom. Fires were laid in the great cold hearths, and slowly, grudgingly, the stone around them began to give up its chill. The first heat is always faint. You have to stand very close to feel it at all. Torches were set in the walls. The hangings went up. Bit by bit the darkness drew back into the corners, and the rooms began to take on the low amber light and the smell of wood smoke that meant a place was lived in. You could watch a dead hall come slowly awake, hearth by hearth, candle by candle, as the night pressed black against the windows. By the time the queen was shown to her chamber, it had been made warm for her, or as warm as an afternoon's labor could manage. The fire burned. The bed was curtained and turned down. The cold, though driven back, still waited in the far corners and along the shuttered window, ready to return the moment the flames sank low. To warm a whole castle from nothing, in a single evening, and then to sleep in it as though it had always been home. That was the ordinary magic of the wandering court, made new each time, against the dark, and never quite finished. There was one time, though, when the queen did not move, when all the wandering stopped and she withdrew instead into a single sealed and darkened room, and there she stayed. This was the custom of a queen taking to her chamber in the last weeks before a child was born. The room was made ready with great care. The windows were shuttered and hung, all but one covered against the light and the air, so that the space fell into a deep and steady dimness, lit only by fire and candle. The walls were hung close on every side, doubled and trebled with cloth, sealing out each draught, each thread of cold that might find its way through the stone. It was the warmest room in the castle, and the stillest and the most shut away. Into this hushed and heavy chamber she went, and the ordinary world was left at the door. Few were permitted in. The men withdrew. She lay among her women in the warm gloom, in a great curtained bed, in a silence broken only by low voices and the small sounds of the fire. Day and night blurred together in a room where no daylight came, only the same soft candle glow, hour after hour. And yet, for all the warmth and all the closeness, it could be a lonely place. A great woman, lying awake in a great cold bed, in the long middle of a winter night. The fire low. Her women asleep around her. And beyond the thick-hung walls, always the wind. You can imagine her lying still and listening to it. The wind working at the shutters, testing the edges, finding the small gaps that no amount of cloth could ever fully close. A faint cold breath along the floor. The creak of timber somewhere in the dark. The whole vast castle sleeping around her, and she alone awake within it, warm and shut away and waiting. It is a strange picture to hold, the most sheltered person in the realm, in the most guarded room, lying sleepless while the winter pressed against the walls. Warmth and loneliness, wrapped together in the same dim, waiting room, through the slow small hours before the dawn. So the wind worked at the shutters, and the queen lay warm. The fire had sunk to embers now, dull and red. Her women slept. Their breathing rose and fell. The room was dark and close and still. beyond the walls, the cold. Within them, the wool, the furs, the low, warm dark. The two held apart by a hand's width of cloth. She lay quiet. She did not move. The night was long, and there was nowhere she needed to be. Somewhere a timber creaked. The embers settled with a soft, small sound. Then nothing. The wind eased. The shutters stilled. The cold went on waiting, patient, as it always did. And the warm bed held her, curtained and deep, through the last dark hours. Nothing stirred. Nothing hurried. The winter simply passed, slow and even, over the sleeping house. And so the queen lies warm and wakeful, and the carts rest in the frozen yard, and the whole great household sinks toward sleep. Now the night deepens, in every room at once. The fires banked, the candles low, the bells of the dark hours drifting from the chapel. Let's stay here, in the quiet, until the morning comes. By now the castle had gone entirely still. The last of the household had settled, the last footstep on the stair had faded, and the great stone rooms held nothing but the cold and the dark. Outside the window there was no moon, or only a thin one behind cloud, and the courtyard below lay black and silent under its frost. Inside the chamber a single candle still burned, set in a dish of iron, its flame leaning and straightening in the small draught that came under the door. The light it gave was very small. It reached the near edge of the bed and the folds of the hangings, and beyond that the room simply dissolved into shadow, the far wall lost, the corners gone. This was the deep middle of the night, the part that had no name and no business. The fires had been banked hours ago, raked down and covered so their heat would last till morning, and the air above them had lost its warmth and turned still and gray. You could feel the cold gathering in the room, settling toward the floor, pressing gently at the shutters. Somewhere far off, muffled by stone and distance, water dripped, from a gutter, from thawing frost, from nothing you could name. It fell in a slow, patient rhythm, one drop and then another, marking a time that no one was awake to count. The sound was so faint that it seemed almost part of the silence itself. The sleeper lay warm and unmoving beneath the weight of the coverings, breathing slow. The world had shrunk to the small circle of the candle and the darker mass of the walls beyond it. Nothing moved. Nothing was expected to move. There were still many hours to go before the light. In a castle of this kind, in the dead of a winter night, there was nothing to do but wait for the dark to wear itself out, slowly, without hurry, as it always did. And so the waiting began. A sleeper in such a castle owned no clock. There were no hands to watch, no dial glowing in the dark, no small ticking beside the bed. Time was not read but heard, and it came from the chapel, from a bell hung in a cold tower somewhere in the walls, or from an abbey a field or two away across the frozen dark. The monks and the chaplains kept the canonical hours, the old divisions of the day and night marked out by prayer, and their bell carried each one out into the sleeping country. Before bed, at the close of the day, they had sung Compline, the last office, the prayer said as the light failed and the doors were shut. Its bell had rung earlier, while the fires still glowed, and it had told everyone within hearing that the day was truly ended. You might remember it now, half in sleep, that single sound rolling out over the roofs, low and even, neither hurried nor sad. It asked nothing. It only said that the working day was done, that the hour of rest had come, and that the dark was to be given over to sleep. The bell was iron and cold, and the man who pulled its rope stood in an unlit room with his breath showing white. The note it made was not sharp, but round and heavy, and it faded very slowly, hanging in the frozen air long after the clapper had gone still. By the time it died away completely, the sound had traveled far out into the fields, softening as it went. To lie in bed and hear Compline was to be told, gently, that all was in order. The gates were barred. The prayers were said. The night watch, such as it was, had begun. There was nothing left to do or decide. So the sleeper let the bell settle him down into the dark, the way it had settled sleepers for hundreds of years. The last office had been sung. Now there was only the long night, and the next bell, waiting somewhere in the hours ahead. Deep in the night, long after Compline had faded, the bell would speak again. This was Matins, the office of the dead hours, sung when the rest of the world lay in its heaviest sleep. In the abbey the monks rose in the cold and the black, feeling their way to the choir, and began the long night prayers while the country slept around them. The bell that called them out reached the castle too. It came muffled through stone and frost, thinner now, a single note repeated and then let fall. A sleeper stirring at that hour might half hear it and know, without waking fully, roughly where in the night he stood, not near morning, not near evening, but in the deep middle, the part furthest from any light. There was something steadying in it. Somewhere out there in the same darkness, men were awake and at their prayers, standing in a cold choir with candles guttering, keeping the old watch. The night was not entirely empty. Even at its blackest, it was being counted, and someone was keeping the count. The chamber itself gave no sign of the hour. The candle had burned lower, its pool of wax spreading in the iron dish, the flame a little smaller than before. The frost had thickened on the inside of the glass. The cold had deepened, quietly, the way it does in the small hours, settling into the stone and the still air. You could hear, if you listened, the tiny sounds that only the deep night allows, the faint tick of the cooling walls, the shift of ash in the banked hearth, the drip of thaw somewhere below. And beneath them all, that far bell, already fading, already gone. For most sleepers, Matins passed unheard, a sound woven into a dream and forgotten. But it rang all the same, night after night, dividing the dark into its old and patient parts. The deepest hour had come and was being marked. And still there was a long way to go before the gray. There was an old habit to the way people slept then, one so ordinary that no one thought to explain it. They did not lie down at night and sleep straight through to morning in a single unbroken stretch. Instead, they slept in two parts, a first sleep and a second sleep, with a quiet waking in the deep of the night between them. The first sleep came early and heavy, taken not long after the light failed, in the warm dark of the shut chamber. It was the deepest of the two, a plunge down into rest while the fires still held some heat and the body was tired from the short winter day. For a few hours the sleeper lay lost to the world, breathing slow, sunk beneath the weight of the coverings. And then, somewhere in the middle of the night, without any bell to wake them, they would surface. This was not the fretful waking of a troubled mind. It was expected, ordinary, unremarkable, a rising into stillness in the black hours, the first sleep spent, the second not yet begun. For a while the sleeper simply lay awake in the dark. The chamber was cold now, the fire banked, the candle low. There was nothing to do and nowhere to be. The night stretched away on either side, and there was time, a strange and quiet pocket of time that belonged to no task and no duty. We know of this habit because it left its traces everywhere, in old prayers written for the hour between sleeps, in letters and sermons and household talk that spoke of the two sleeps as plainly as we might speak of morning and evening. It was simply how the night was made. To wake in the dark like that was not a fault to be fixed, but a part of rest itself. The first sleep was over. The waking had come, as it always came. And ahead, still waiting, lay the long warm slide of the second sleep. The waking hour between the two sleeps had a character all its own. It was the stillest time in the whole turning of the day, the fires low, the household down, the world outside frozen and unlit. And into that stillness the sleeper rose, gently, with hours of dark still on every side. Some used the hour for prayer. It was thought a good time for it, this quiet pocket of the night, when the mind was calm and unhurried and nothing pressed. Old books of devotion set out prayers meant for exactly this waking, words to be murmured in the dark before sinking back down. A soft, half-whispered line set into the cold, and then silence again. Others simply lay still and let their thoughts drift where they would, over the day just gone, over small worries and small comforts, the way the mind wanders when it has no task to hold it. Some talked, low and unhurried, to whoever shared the warmth, a few soft words, an answer half given, then quiet, and many did nothing at all. They lay warm beneath the weight of the coverings and only listened to the tick of the cooling stone, to the wind testing the shutters, to the faint drip of thaw somewhere below in the dark. The cold was all around the bed, but under the furs the warmth held, and there was a deep animal contentment in simply being warm while the night pressed cold against the glass. There was no hurry to any of it. No bell would ring to end the hour. It lasted as long as it lasted, and then, of its own accord, the sleeper grew heavy again, the thoughts slowing, the eyes falling shut. This was the turning point of the night, the still center around which the dark revolved. The prayers were murmured, or the words were said, or nothing was said at all. And slowly, without deciding to, the sleeper began to sink once more toward the second sleep. The warm dark closed over again. Not every waking in the dark was so peaceful. The deep of the night was also the hour when old fears crept close, the fear of the dark itself, and behind it, unspoken, the fear of dying in it, alone and unshriven, before the light came back. Many a night prayer was murmured against exactly that, a small plea sent up into the black. So the candle was left to burn. A watching light, set where awaking I could find it, so that no one need surface in a total dark. It was a small comfort and a real one, that steady little flame in its iron dish, leaning and straightening, keeping one corner of the room from vanishing entirely. By this hour it had burned very low. The wax had spread and pooled, the wick stood short in its shallow lake of light, and the flame had shrunk to something small and blue at its base. It threw almost no heat. But it held, and while it held there was that one soft point to fix on in the dark. The cold, meanwhile, had reached its worst. It always did, in the last stretch before dawn, the stored heat of the day long spent, the stone chilled through, the air above the banked fire gone gray and still. Frost had climbed thick on the inside of the glass, feathered and white, and the draught under the door carried the true cold of the courtyard. And somewhere in that hardest cold, before any light showed, a groom would rise. He rose in the black, feeling his way to the hearth, and knelt to the banked fire, raking off the covering ash, breathing on the buried embers, coaxing the small red glow back into flame so that the household might wake to warmth. His was the first waking of the coming day, done in the dark for everyone still asleep. The bell for prime, the office at the very edge of dawn, had not yet rung. But it was coming. And the fire, slowly, began to catch. And then, so slowly that no one could have named the moment, the dark began to thin, not brighten. Only thin, the black of the windows softening by the smallest degree toward a deep, cold gray. The first light of the winter morning was coming, without hurry, without warmth, the way it always came. At the shutters it showed first as a paleness at the edges, a faint seam of gray where the black had been solid. The frost on the inside of the glass caught it and held it, those white feathers of ice glowing very faintly now, lit from behind by nothing more than the graying sky. The chamber was still deep in shadow, but its shapes were returning, one by one, out of the dark: the mass of the bed, the fall of the hangings, the pale dish where the candle had all but drowned in its own wax. They came back not sharp but soft, gray on gray, the way things surface slowly from a dream. The sleeper lay unmoving, deep in the second sleep, breathing slow and even. The warmth still held beneath the coverings, and the cold still pressed at the glass, and between them the body rested on, unhurried, unaware that the light had begun to come. The newly coaxed fire had settled to a low, steady glow in the hearth, and the faint smell of wood smoke hung soft in the air. The room was very quiet. Only the slow breathing and the tick of the cooling stone, and outside, far off, the first thin stir of a waking bird. There was no bell yet. No footstep on the stair. Only the gray coming up at the window, gentle and cold and patient. The night was ending the way it had passed, without event, without haste, one soft shade giving way to the next. Morning was not here, but it was near. And the gray light widened, very slowly, at the edge of the glass. The gray deepened at the window, and the frost on the glass glowed a little paler, and the room lay very still. The fire held its low glow in the hearth. The candle had gone out at last, drowned in its own wax, and no one had noticed. The sleeper breathed on, slow and even, warm beneath the weight of the coverings. There was nothing to wake for yet, nothing to do. The cold pressed soft at the glass, and the warmth held, and between them the long rest went on. Outside, the courtyard lay gray and silent under its frost, the roofs pale, the sky the color of ash. The great stone castle stood quiet around its sleepers, holding the last of the dark inside its walls, giving it up only slowly to the coming light. You could hear the smallest sounds now. The settle of an ember, the tick of the cooling wall, the faint, far bird, and under it all, the slow breathing, in and out, unhurried in the gray. The night had turned. The deepest cold was past. The light was coming, soft and gray and cold, the way it always came. There was nothing more to wait for. Only the breathing, and the embers, and the great quiet of the stone. Only the gray light, widening, slow. Only sleep. And so the night goes on, as it has for centuries. The fire burns low. The castle sleeps. And perhaps, by now, so do you. If you're still awake, that's perfectly fine. There's nowhere you need to be. Nothing you need to do. The archive will be here tomorrow night, as always. Sleep well.